Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Nelson Bulmash. I am the host of Health Matters with Dr. Nelson Bulmash, which has been seen in 90 countries around the world on multiple FM stations, AM stations, and on every major podcast platform here in the United States. I'm also a practicing clinician as a chiropractor, certified traditional naturopath. I have 2 diplomates in nutrition and 7 advanced subspecialties in nutrition. I've also been practicing for about 20, just shy of 29 years in the metropolitan Atlanta, Georgia area. I want to have actually, I should say, I'm sorry, I was originally going to do this live and I'm not, so I'm thrown a little bit. I'm going to do this as a pre-recording, and then at some point they're going to air this to you. I don't know when that'll be, but I hope you find this fascinating. We're going to discuss something that I haven't heard talked about since I was, I may have done a little bit of it when I was working on my doctorate in chiropractic and a lot of the work I did in naturopathy, but not really since I took a lot of micro classes in college at the University of Michigan. We're going to talk about defending yourself against viruses. We're going to begin to explore natural strategies to help protect you and your patients against viral assaults. I hope you find it very, very interesting. This is going to be a little tough for me because I'm told I only have 10 to 20 minutes. So anybody who knows me knows that I like to talk, and 10 to 20 minutes is not very long. If you do like what I have to share, and I think you're going to find it quite interesting, let the people over at Numedica know that you enjoyed it and that you'd like to hear more. I have a lot more information about this that I can give. But I want to do this for you today. Most of the clinicians I know very, very little about how to actually protect themselves and their patients against viruses. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about strategies, about tactics that are very, very effective in helping you take care of defending against viral insult. So let me begin, and I'm sorry this isn't live. Once again, originally I thought it would be, and that way you could ask questions, but no problem. If you're interested in anything further, there are many other topics that I can go into much more detail about this topic, and I can talk specifically about ways to handle things like what we're going through right now. And I'm a little hesitant, as you can tell, because I'm told that I've got to be very careful about specifically talking about the COVID-19 virus. There are some people who are very uppity about sharing anything that might protect you or your patients against this novel virus. So once again, we'll get started here. We're going to talk about defending against viruses. Here we go. Let us begin. Oftentimes we forget about some of the most basic things, and here's what I mean by that. One of the most important strategies that you can do, and don't worry, everything isn't going to be this simple, but is to hydrate properly. And here's why. Because when you're not hydrated, and I think about 70% of the population of the United States, at least easily 70% of my patients come in chronically dehydrated, you end up with 3 potential risks. And I know there are many more, but the 3 that are immediately present in my mind are, number 1, that when you're dehydrated, the mucosa tends to develop fissures very, very readily, particularly this time of year when it's cool out and we have forced dry, heated air. Many of you, I'm sure, have had patients, for example, who every year get some kind of a sinus infection. Well, this is one of the biggest culprits. They don't drink enough water, and so they get fissures in their mucous membranes in their sinuses. As a result, they're easily penetrated by bacteria and viruses. Reason number 1, make sure that you do not have fissures due to dehydration in your mucous membranes in the sinuses. Number 2, dehydration leads to thinner mucous membranes in general. Mucous membranes should be beautifully thick. It's the difference between a contracted dry sponge and a sponge that's containing water. When your mucous membranes are fully hydrated, they're much thicker and much more difficult, once again, to penetrate by pathogens. And number 3, another thing that a lot of my colleagues tend to forget, there's always this, I forgot about that moment, when I talk about the importance of hydration with regards to increasing the effectiveness of the ciliated columnar epithelial cells that line the respiratory tract. They're there for a reason, folks, and they're there, of course, as we know, to sweep out debris like pathogens when we're invaded. And this is really, really important because in a lot of cases, you can lower the exposure load through droplet that you breathe in when somebody coughs, sneezes, or even speaks close to you and they spit a lot when they talk. Or if you maybe you're shaking hands with somebody, they cough in their hand, they don't wash their hand, they shake your hand, and then you put your hands in your mouth to eat. So this is very, very important because these ciliated columnar epithelial cells that line the respiratory tract sweep debris out of the respiratory tract into the mouth, where you then swallow it, and then it's destroyed by your stomach acid. And I know some of you are very sharp and you're thinking, well, Nelson, a lot of my patients don't have strong stomach acid. That's right. That's why you got to make sure that in addition to being hydrated, that they take enough sea salt that has 84 to 94 trace elements in it. And one, as you know, is that it has sodium chloride. The chloride ion disassociates from the sodium and binds to a hydrogen molecule, and you get what? So you get hydrochloric acid. And this hydrochloric acid is very important because it not only digests your food, but it's also very important in killing pathogens that you swallow, whether it be directly or they're swept out of the respiratory tract and then you're swallowed, and then destroyed by your stomach acid. This is very, very important. So all of these simple natural processes are very, very effective in helping to reduce your risk of getting ill. And these are some of the basic reasons that a lot of people do or don't get sick. Okay, let's say you weren't properly hydrated, or maybe you were properly hydrated, but you got such a massive load. Maybe somebody coughed, a foot or two away from you or sneezed on you or something like this. The first step of the virus is something called viral adherence. And viral adherence is where the virus produces an agglutinin, which is a glue-like substance called hemagglutinin. And that's what allows the virus to attach to the membranes of your passageways, whether they be your sinuses or whether they're your respiratory passages, right? So the first thing that has to happen is the virus obviously has to get into your body. The second thing is it has to be able to get to where it wants to go. Now, a lot of these horrible influenzas or the coronavirus, I can speak very generally about this, likes to go specifically to the sinuses and eventually to the respiratory passageways, specifically the alveolar membranes, right? These are the distal ends of the respiratory trees, these thin membranes that allow for oxygen to diffuse into the capillary beds that line the membranes of the alveolar cells. They're very, very delicate. And so if they can adhere, then suddenly the real action of the virus begins to happen. If they can't, then it can't attach. It's harmless. It has to adhere. It must adhere to your epithelial cells so that it can do anything. Unless it's injected, like you have certain insects, for example, mosquitoes. If they bite you, they can inject the virus directly into the blood. But nonetheless, it still has to get to where it needs to go, and then it still has to attach. Now, here's a brilliant defense tactic against adherence of viruses. You can use specific plants like Chinese skullcap and ginger. Why? Because they're called hemagglutinin inhibitors. And their role in this capacity is to specifically inhibit the adherence of the virus to its receptor, its host cell. Very, very important. Now, I'm going to see if I can think about some of the questions that you might have to ask me. For example, I know some of you are thinking, well, Nelson, Chinese skullcap's kind of hard to get a hold of. And that's true, it is. Now, I'm not an herbalist. I'm not a virologist. I'm not an epidemiologist. I am not a microbiologist. If you confuse me with my father. He was a very, very accomplished, brilliant microbiologist who spent a lot of time in virology, epidemiology. He taught, he did research. He was the first person in the world to solve a number of health problems that had not been identified before. And as a very good father and as a brilliant man, he took a lot of time to teach me because I was fascinated in microbiology and actually was so fascinated that I thought about becoming a microbiologist, and he dissuaded me because it was not something he thought that at that point in my life that I would be able to support my family well on. And so I got into chiropractic, naturopathy, and nutrition instead, which he was very proud of me for, and found a great deal of pleasure in talking to me about how I did some of the things I did and how they prevented people from suffering from intense infections by pathogens like viruses. That was fascinating to him because he worked in medicine. So he used things like antibiotics for bacteria. And as you know, not much was available. We're going to talk a little bit about what's available against viruses, but you'll get very quickly, there aren't a lot of drugs for viruses. And You'll know why shortly. So once again, we stay hydrated. Ideally, of course, we prevent the organism by social distancing and proper hygiene from even getting into our body. But if it does get in our body, we want to make sure we're hydrated and we want to make sure the virus doesn't adhere. Okay, so let's say the virus adheres. We're not drinking enough water. Maybe it's a day where we were working out hard, we're a little dehydrated. The ciliated action of our columnar epithelial cells and respiratory tract weren't sweeping as effectively. And what happens? Well, we end up with some of the viruses in our respiratory tract. Well, when they adhere, they do something that's very, very interesting. The viruses produce an enzyme called neuraminidase. And the neuraminidase is also called silidase because, excuse me, what the virus does is it attacks the, excuse me, I'm so sorry, I'm having pollen issues. I went out for a long walk before I got here and I'm allergic to pollen, so I'm struggling here a little bit, so please forgive. The virus produces this enzyme called neuraminidase, and neuraminidase attacks the celiac acid linkages on the cell membrane. And this is very, very important because when it produces the silidase enzyme, also known as neuraminidase, it causes a very interesting process known as endocytosis, which means the cell membrane invaginates, allows the welcoming in of the virus, and then the membrane closes up. And the virus triggers or stimulates the cell to produce what's called a vacuole, which is an organelle within the cytoplasm of the cell. Now, this is very, very important because the virus knows that it can't stay long hanging out on the cell membrane because it knows that the longer it stays there, if you will, the greater the chance of it being destroyed by our immune system. So it's very, very brilliant. It uses an interesting way to attach to very specific sites on the cell membrane where it can adhere. And then through endocytosis, it's taken into the cell where it's further protected. Now, some of you really sharp doctors know that you have antimicrobial agents that are actually produced even within the cell to destroy pathogens or substances that shouldn't be within the cell. You're absolutely right. So what happens is that the cell forms vacuoles, and vacuoles are like storage units, right, within the cell. So the cell can keep things in there that are dangerous to it. So once the virus is in the vacuole, it's once again, it's both invisible to the white blood cells that would kill it if it were remaining outside, attached to the outside of the cell, and it's also now invisible to the antimicrobial agents within the cytoplasm of the cell. Now, once again, what does it do? It secretes the hemagglutinin, which is that glue-like substance that allows it to stay suspended to the inside membrane of the vacuole. Now, I want to mention one other thing, and that is that this is the place, if you will, that Tamiflu can be used. If you're somebody who uses drugs, you go to the hospital, you have a bad viral infection, sometimes they give you a drug called Tamiflu. And Tamiflu works in the same way that Chinese skullcap, elder, licorice, rhodiola, isatis, ginger, and quercetin, to name a few, all work, right? They're inhibitors of the neuraminidase enzyme, which means that, yes, the virus can stay attached to the cell, but it can't penetrate it, right? So this is the choice drug for that. And as I will mention again, Chinese skullcap, elder, licorice, rhodiola, quercetin, isatis, and ginger are all very, very effective as inhibitors of the neuraminidase so that the virus can't be welcomed into the cell. Viruses are very, very clever. And so this is another tactic is, you take these things. Chinese skullcap is amazing for decreasing the ability of the virus to get penetration into the cell, right? But other things can as well. You're going to find, if you like what I have to say and you want to hear some of my other lectures, you're going to find licorice, ginger are fantastic. They have tremendous capacity in multiple stages to, I'm going to say very playfully, I'm going to make up a word here, unwelcome, if you will, the virus into the cell so that it can make more viruses. Okay, now let's talk about endocytosis, which once again, when this neuraminidase is produced, this enzyme creates an alteration in the permeability of the cell membrane and the cytoskeleton. It's really incredible how it alters its shape so the virus can now enter. And then the virus begins to hijack your cell and its contents, including the nucleus, which is where it begins ultimately to do the copying of the RNA so that you can have multiple viruses made. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So the next step, once the virus is adherent to the inner membrane of the vacuole, is that it creates something that is really, once again, quite ingenious. It's called the M2 ion channel or pore. This is a very important process. You see, once we get to this point, we're in danger, Will Robinson land, because the virus is protected by not being recognized within the cell by the immune cells that scavenge viruses, bacteria, parasites, and so forth. So it's not evidently apparent to them, but also it's now safeguarded against the antimicrobial agents that are produced within the cell to scavenge and to remove anything like a virus that could destroy the inner contents of the cell. So the virus creates this M2 ion channel or pore. And this is very, very important in the worst influenzas like the swine flus and the bird flus, which, by the way, are typically going to be influenza A strains. And influenza A strains are the worst. All of the major pandemics that I can think of were the Tokyo, the pandemic of 1918, the bird flu, the swine flu, 2002, 2009. These are all influenza A strains. These are typically the most virulent, although it's not impossible to get nasty influenza B strains and C. C is pretty rare. You can have B, but typically the big game changers, the really scary viruses are the influenza A strains. Okay? Now, this is key here because if you screw this step up as a cell, right, then you're in real trouble. Because if you screw this step up, it means that the virus is going to get replicated and then will be released to take over other cells. Now, what's important here is that there are specific agents, and this is key here, folks, okay? So really listen carefully to this. What the body can do, if it's given the right materials, is it can block both the release of the RNA, and skullcap is your agent for that. Very, very powerful. And before I go on, I do want to say this. Once again, I'm not an herbalist. The American herbalists insist that whatever the Chinese skullcap can do, the American species can do the same. The Chinese use the roots. The Americans sometimes use the roots, but they usually use the leaves. I did not find anything about whether that is true or not. You may have to do a little bit more research. I'll continue to do more research, but the American herbalists swear that it can do, the American versions can do whatever the Chinese versions can do. Jury's out for me, but that's what they claim. Okay, now, let's step back a moment here. When we open the channel or pore, the virus is then triggered once it has all the ingredients it needs. And the purpose of this, by the way, is that charged molecules can go in and out of this channel. So the virus can bring into the vacuole what it needs to further create whatever needs to be created. And it can send its waste out into the cytoplasm through the same channel. Now, I have to share something very, very exciting to you because there is a Native American herb, and I'm trying to find it, and here it is. Somehow I skipped a slide. Called Lomatium. And Lomatium is unbelievable. Native Americans used this, not probably knowing that it was an M2 ion channel blocker, but they used it for all kinds of infections. My understanding is they used it to treat pneumonia, bronchitis, influenza, COPD. Once again, they probably didn't know what COPD was, but it's used for that. And it can be used even, for urinary or kidney infections. So many different uses, but Lomatium is really incredible. And this is one of those cases, folks, that the plant, and this is a North American plant, once again used by Native Americans, it's so fantastic because it does something that's so brilliant. It blocks the ion channel. So this M2 ion channel or pore, whichever you prefer, gets blocked. If you can block this, you stop the entire progression of the next step, which is that the virus is disassembled, goes through the pore, and then goes into the cytoplasm where it's reassembled along with core proteins, like the proteins that allow it to make hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, and then it's shuttled into the nucleus. And boy, if you don't block that step, you're in big, big, big trouble. Because once this complex gets into the nucleus of the cell, that's when it hijacks your DNA. And it does something that's quite interesting from a survival strategy. What it does is it hijacks your DNA, and your DNA begins to be copied, right? Because this is RNA. So the RNA copies are made and then assembled with these other core proteins to form more viruses. So it's imperative that you block that ion channel. And the most powerful, and this is particularly with the influenza A's, right? Very, very important for the influenzas, but particularly the worst of the worst. So this is something you always want to have access to. You want to be able to find Lomatium and have its many uses, because it is critical. You block that. Once you block that pore, you can't disassemble the virus, get it out, and then have it shuttled into the nucleus. And once that step is broken, then you don't get new viral particles. Now, that cell may or may not die with the result of the virus. It probably would continue to live for some time. It will definitely die if the next step, where the RNA goes into the nucleus, and then the nucleus just starts manufacturing lots and lots and lots of viruses, right? So this is the case where Lomatium, this North American plant, is even more powerful than the drug amantadine, which is used by farmers. As a matter of fact, here's where we get into a problem, folks. Many of you might be wondering, Nelson, how in the world are we getting more and more of these crazy flus? Well, the reason is because we have a much larger world population. Even the United States, I mean, the population is probably somewhere around 350 million if you include a lot of the illegal immigrants that are in this country. I'm sure it's at least 330 million, right? So that means we have to have a lot of, for you non-vegans, that means we have to have a lot of people who do what? They eat chicken, they eat pork, and often pork and chicken factories, right, are pretty close together. And so what happens, for example, like in the great pandemic of 1918, what happened is quite fascinating. You had a bird flu that jumped species. And when it jumped species, in about 1915 or so, 1913 and 1915, you had a leg that infected humans and a leg that infected pigs. Now that 2009, as I recall, the swine flu hit. In 2009, that was a descendant. That was a direct descendant, if you will, of the swine flu of the great pandemic of 1918. So these things don't go away. They seem to disappear for a period of time, but often, look at this. It came back in 2009, the original plague that we're aware of, and it could have come before that, was somewhere around probably 1915-ish, right? So you had those two legs form. Well, this is probably going to begin to happen more and more because we have animals in situations where they're ridiculously overcrowded, which means they're usually sick, and you can have pig farms and chicken farms very close together. So what happens is that a virus somehow gets from one group of animals to another, and you get something called viral rearrangement, which means the virus rearranges its genetic material. And when that happens, it can be suddenly where maybe only was something that bothered mostly non-humans, right? Birds of different species. Now suddenly it can jump species and infect us, right? And so the great pandemic of 1918 was actually, it started out as a bird flu, influenza A type, and then once again jumped species and became an influenza type A influenza that I believe, I don't want to confuse you. I don't want to get too detailed in this. I believe it was never mind. My apologies. For some reason it skips me now. But it became something that would suddenly infect humans, is my point. And the first wave of that killed about 17 million people. Then it mutated, and then it came back and killed about 123 million people. Once again, what really took this off is this. You had soldiers fighting in trenches, so you had trench warfare, where people were in very close proximity. And what happened was they were weak, they were tired, they weren't hydrated, they weren't eating well. And then when the war ended in 1918, what happened? They weren't quarantined, they were taken to ports primarily, where they went all over the world. And once they were quarantined, it was too late. And before this was over with, it killed 20% of the population. So 20% of those people who were, 20% of the population who got this died. It was a very, 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 very lethal influenza strain. So when I tell you these things, they're important to look at, because we're going through an interesting time right now. And I finally saw a little light at the end of the tunnel yesterday. I was watching the Bill Maher show, and there was a doctor, I believe his name was Dr. Katz. He's an epidemiologist, a graduate from Yale. And he said, you know, here's the reality. We haven't developed any vaccines for SARS viruses, right? So he said, at best, it might be 18 months. He said, what we really need to start working on is actually improving the quality of immunity individual by individual. And I was shocked to hear this, because this is something I haven't heard. Not only have I not heard it, I've been told you don't even talk about in this country as a chiropractor, nutritionist, or any other adjunct healthcare professional to medicine, that you have something that might improve immunity against the COVID-19 virus, which is just insane to me. But as many of you know, working clinically, you probably know that you shouldn't be making any claims unless you want to have the medical board, unless you want to have the pharmaceutical industry, you need to have the FCC and the FDA come down upon you. I was given strict communication. Don't get caught in the middle of that, or your head will be on the chopping block. So this is an important conversation to have. And if you find this interesting, I'd like to do more of these. We're just going to have to talk in a way that you fill in the dots, so to speak, or the spaces. Okay? So once again, this is a case where Lomatium is even stronger than the drug, which is called amantadine. And farmers are using so much of this amantadine that it is actually becoming less and less and less effective. But Lomatium is not overused, and so it's still very, very effective. Okay, so I want to mention now, once again, I should mention, I'm trying to summarize this now, because I know I'm probably at about 27 minutes now. Once again, Chinese skullcap prevents viral RNA release. I want to mention some things that are very important, and I know probably this is old hat to most of you, but vitamin A, vitamin D3 are very critical for immune cell modulation. Zinc is very important. And I'll mention, there are many reasons, but I'll mention two of them. Zinc is very, very important. Actually, I'll give you three reasons. One is because it's necessary, along with some specific amino acids, copper and selenium, to make glutathione. And if you happen to be that person who's having a great deal of difficulty and you get put on a ventilator, you absolutely want to make sure you're taking things, and in that case, it may be IV glutathione, but liposomal glutathione is very, very powerful too, because you're getting so much oxygen that suddenly the oxygen is setting the lungs on fire as a free radical. And so how do you stop that? How do you limit that? Well, glutathione is probably your best choice, right? But now we have companies like Numedica who are fantastic. They've got glutathione, they have curcumin, they have vitamin C in liposomal form. And what do we know about that? Well, we know that that's a brilliant way to stop cytokine storms or greatly limit the damage done by them. And I really want to have a separate talk about that, because this is a very, very important conversation to have. And you have PPQ that'll do that as well. These are so critical because they stop the immune cell from destroying itself, right? And what I'd like to do in another talk is talk to you about some of the viral strategies against the host strategies. And one is to increase very specific cytokines so that specific things happen that end up with you destroying yourself. It's a fascinating conversation to have, and we can have that if you'd like. So vitamin A, vitamin D3, we talked about. Zinc, I talked about, is very important because it's used to make glutathione. It's also very, very important, folks, to actually stop viral replication. And I want to talk about 2 or 3 more things. One is, for those of you who haven't used Argentyn 23 or the equivalent hydrosol form of silver, in other words, it's a nanized form of silver, the military did some really exciting research on this. I think they even did double-blind studies, as I recall, and found that silver is very, very effective against many viruses. And the major action is that it destroys the polyhedron capsid coating of the virus. Very, very powerful. So I might hint that you put an ounce of that in a humidifier that contains a gallon of water and let yourself perhaps breathe that in all night long if you get a bad respiratory infection, and then find out how powerfully it is at helping to disable the virus. Incredible strategy. We also have mushroom complexes. Goodness gracious, they have cell wall components known as beta-glucans, which are really, really powerful immune modulators. They really engage macrophages, monocytes, neutrophils. Very, very effective. And the last thing I want to talk about, another amazing product by Numedica, is they have, in 3 different forms, they have tablet form, liquid form, and powder form colostrum with PRP. And this is remarkable at helping with many different pathogen infections. Should really review that. Love to use it for improving the general well-being of people, and specifically for gut pathogens, bacterial and viral. I hope this was valuable to you. Once again, I'm Dr. Nelson Blumreich. If you enjoyed this, please tell the folks over at Numedica you'd like to hear more, and I'm happy to give more. Have a wonderful, wonderful night. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation.